Looking at your preference values might feel like a horoscope reading your mind. When you see them, you might think, wow, this is exactly how I feel about these criteria. How'd you know? Well, 1000 Minds knew your preferences because of the trade-offs you made, which is what established your preference values. On the preference values page, we can examine in more detail how important each of our criteria is to us by looking at a series of graphs and charts that break down the preference values of our criteria and their levels in a variety of different ways. And just like with any other term in 1000 Minds, we can customize the name preference values and change it to anything we want by clicking on the drop-down menu in the menu on the right. For example, they're also often called point values or points, or we can call it anything else that we want that makes more sense to us. The first table shows the preference values of each criterion and the degree of performance of each category in the criterion. The preference value of the highest category represents the relative importance of that criterion. So, for example, great weather has a preference value of 38.9%, and that number also represents the relative importance of the weather criterion as a whole. The numbers in bold will sum to a total of 100%. This allows you to interpret the preference values of your criteria in relative terms. For example, public transport is roughly 4 times as important to us as the beach. Our ideal alternative, if it existed, would have the highest level in each of these categories, which, when you sum together the bolded numbers, gives it a total score of 100%. That is your highest ranked possible alternative, which you can view under all possible alternatives. The lowest ranked possible alternative, on the other hand, would be the one that has the lowest level in each of these criteria, which gives it a total score of 0. The preference values are also displayed as bar graphs, but this can be toggled off in the menu on the right. Here, we can also choose whether we want the criteria ordered by the relative importance, or if we want them in the order that we enter them in on the criteria page. A more condensed and visual way to view the relative importances of these criteria is the polar chart. The bigger the radius of the sector, the greater the preference value of the criterion. So we see that weather has the largest radius because it is the most important, and beach has the smallest radius because that criterion matters to us the least when making our decision. As you can see, you can view the legend and exact percentages of each category by hovering over a sector. Maybe we want to know the exact ratios of the preference values of our criteria relative to each other. When deciding what city to move to, how much more important is the weather to us than public transportation? If we scroll down, we see this table here which gives us exactly those ratios. Any number in bold means that the criterion in the column is that much more important than the criterion in the row corresponding to that number. And the inverse is true for the numbers that are not bolded. So now we know that the weather is 1.3 times as important to us as public transportation, or alternatively, public transportation is 0.8 times as important to us as weather. Wow, that's neat! Lastly, here is a line graph that shows us how the preference values of each of our criteria increase by category. Of particular interest is the curvature of each line. Is it linear, or is the slope increasing or decreasing? This tells us how much the preference value would increase by moving to higher categories on a criterion. So for example, we see that weather increases a lot as it moves up in category, but public transport and nightlife increase a lot at first, but then they level off when you move between the second to highest and the highest category. Now that we understand these charts, we want to export some of this data. We can export the table of our preference values by clicking the export button on the top, which gives us an Excel file with the table. The charts can be exported as image files by clicking on the three lines at the top right of the chart area. So now you know what it is that really matters to you and how much.